Good afternoon. Is the sound okay, Paloma? Yes. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Adela Pineda Franco, and I am the director of LILAS, the Teresa Lozano Long Institute of Latin American Studies here at UT Austin. And today, we're very happy to host two amazing scholars of pre-Hispanic culture, David Stuart, our colleague here at UT Austin, and David Carballo, my former colleague at Boston University. This is in the frame within our book series. David Stuart recently published King and Cosmos, an interpretation of the Aztec Calendar Stone. And we think that this is a major work, and we are so happy that David Carballo accepted our invitation to comment on this book. The book focuses on iconic artwork of the famous Calendar Stone of Tenochtitlan, but it has a broader purpose, as you will see from the discussion. I don't think David Stuart needs a wide introduction. Everybody knows who he is because of his amazing career in the field. I'm just going to say that his primary research focuses on epigraphy and archaeology of ancient Maya civilization. And for the past 3 decades, he has been very active in decipherment of Maya hieroglyphic writing in several regions of Mexico and Guatemala. He has been the recipient of several fellowships and prizes, and I don't think I have to go further, particularly a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellowship. David Carballo is also a foremost scholar in Mesoamerican archaeology, and he focuses particularly on the pre-Hispanic civilization of central Mexico. He has currently two amazing projects at the ancient city of Teotihuacan. One is the Proyecto Arqueológico Tlajinga, and the second is the Proyecto Plaza de Columnas. The first seeks to understand urbanization, neighborhood organization, and the daily life of commoners through excavations and geophysical prospection within a southern city, a southern district of the city. And the second is focused on a palace compounds and is aimed at understanding the city's political economy. So I think this will be a very delightful after-lunch conversation, and thank you both. And I will mute myself.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Adela, and Paloma for inviting me to present. And I also want to thank David for taking time out of his busy day to join us all the way from Boston. David and I go way back, and it's great to see you. I'm going to start sharing my screen and hoping that works here. I'll be talking for about 30 or 40 minutes. I hope you all can see that, my title slide here. And it was a challenge to kind of compress some of my earlier presentations on this particular topic. I've given a few talks on this, but to do so in 30 or 40 minutes, I'm not going to cover everything, of course. This is a decidedly complicated monument, both historiographically and historically in terms of its iconography. But I do want to try to hit some high points here in the next 30 or 40 minutes. The book, King and Cosmos, was published by Pre-Columbia Mesoweb Press at the beginning of last year. And just to kind of preface all of this, I do want to mention that the book grew out of kind of an unusual circumstance. I'm not very well known for my work with Aztec art. I'm predominantly a Mayanist, although I consider myself a Mesoamericanist. I'm very much of the opinion that the pre-Columbian cultures of Mesoamerica were very much interacting with each other over the centuries and informed each other, influenced each other. And this is certainly, I think, the case with Aztec and their awareness of a deeper past of Mesoamerica that included the Maya. And so even though I haven't published quite a bit before this in Aztec studies, I've studied it quite a bit and had some really wonderful teachers along the way. Richard Andrews at Vanderbilt in my graduate student days, Henry B. Nicholson, Thelma Sullivan, all people who encouraged my work in Mexica, Aztec hieroglyphs and Nahuatl language. So this has been brewing for a while, but this project specifically came out of a class that I teach here regularly at UT, which is an undergraduate course on Aztec art. And, you know, I've given this class now for, over a decade, 15 years almost. And there was one year, I think it was in 2015, where I was lecturing, as I often did, about the Piedra del Sol, or the Calendar Stone. And I kind of had a revelation of in a sense, while I was in class. I kind of stopped everything and had the students sort of reschedule courses and not their courses, but my syllabus in terms of taking a deeper dive into this, because I started thinking about it in new ways that I hadn't really done so before. It's a difficult topic. I should also preface everything by saying, you know, this is such an iconic artwork. I mean, there are very few like it in the world when you think about it, in terms of an image that you see over and over again, reproduced on tequila bottles, on T-shirts, on David's shirt that he's wearing today here. He has the Mexico football jersey. And, you know, it's just one of those things where you just see it so often, it almost numbs you in terms of what it is, you know, in terms of how we understand it as a cultural object. So I want to try to get past all of that if we can. My very strong feeling is that the understanding of this monument, this iconic artwork of Mexico, that our understanding today is very incomplete, or has been incomplete. It still is, and that it is very often misunderstood. And this goes back decades and even centuries in terms of the baggage, intellectual baggage, that it has accrued over time. In some ways, it's a transcendent image, right? Because it's been wrenched away from its original context, even on display here in the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City. It is not displayed in any way similar to the way it was originally meant to be seen. It was never originally designed to be seen vertically like this on a wall. It was designed, in fact, to be horizontal, to be flat. But of course, this is how it's displayed and has been. It's been wrenched of its context. There are many meanings that people assume about it, and significances that it was never really intended to have. So I want to, you know, it's impossible again to go through all of this, but I do want to kind of hit some high points. This is a drawing that I made of the main design for the book. And you can just see in the drawing how dense it is as a image. There is a great deal of iconography here. One of the points of the book was to make a rather simplistic point, which is that much of Aztec iconography, or Mexica iconography, like any other culture in Mesoamerica, is very much wedded to writing and script. In fact, it's very hard to tease these categories of writing and iconography, or writing and art. It's hard to tease those apart in a Mesoamerican context. And I think this is a quintessential example of this. It may be a slight overstatement, but I do think that much of what you're seeing in this image here is hieroglyphic in nature. That is, it is a standalone, multi-layered image of different hieroglyphs that are fused together, embedded into one another in a very intentional, very elegant way. And that's part of its messaging. So there are three things I'd like to kind of cover here in the time we have, and that is some ideas about its original function as a monument, as a space. This is somewhat speculative because, again, it was discovered in a very non-archaeological context in the year 1790. It's been around for a long time, so it's very hard to kind of look at its original context in that sense, physically. I also want to look at its precedents, and this is something that I think has not really been appreciated. The designers of the calendar stone were not creating something completely new. It was very ambitious for its time, but it was coming out of the artist's own knowledge of earlier Mesoamerican kinds of sculptures and monuments and designs having to do with cosmology, of course, with the sun, of course, but other things as well. And I would argue that this has a lot to do also with the presentation of political portraiture. And this gets us to the third category, which is about the image. What is it, right? Again, I could spend 2 or 3 hours going through all of the images. I'm not going to do that. But I do want to focus on the identity in the center of the composition, that face that everyone sees, that grimacing face, and the debates over the years and decades about what it is, who it is, and my own kind of novel take on that. So to kind of start the ball rolling here, to get us into these specifics, in terms of function, one of the things I'm going to be arguing is that it was perhaps originally set very close to where it was discovered in the what's now the Zócalo of Mexico City, that it was an altar in the plaza in front of the palace of Moctezuma II, Moctezuma Xocoyotzin. And in particular, that it was a kind of altar called a momostli in Nahuatl, which is literally means something like a daily place. And that idea of a day resonates very much with the idea of the sun and the imagery that's on the stone itself. In terms of precedents, as I just said, in fact, the altar concept in Mesoamerica goes back centuries. And many of these disc-shaped altars that we find in other central Mexican sites, but I see a lot of these in the Maya area, actually embody time and embody cosmology and embody political ideology in a way that the calendar stone does. So I'm going to look at some Maya precedents for this that I think are very much kind of templates, at least conceptually, for the calendar stone. And finally, what I want to talk about is the role of that face in the center as what I'm calling a deified portrait, that it is a historical representation of Moctezuma himself as a sun deity, and also as the Mexica patron god Huitzilopochtli, all specifically labeled by hieroglyphs around it. And this is something that hasn't really been articulated before. So here's a well-known image. The first publication of the calendar stone was right after it was discovered in 1790, published in 1791. This is one of the first publications, in fact, of a Mesoamerican monument, and a rather accurate drawing, actually, that was done at the time. Antonio Leoni Gama did a very important initial analysis, one of the first kind of artistic iconographic analyses of a Mesoamerican monument. And you have to remember that in 1790, there was no visible vestiges of the ancient Aztec capital really visible at all, in at least in the center of the city. There were mounds and buildings around in the late 19th and late 18th century, but none of the great monuments that we're familiar with. With the discovery of this in 1790, this really was the birth of archaeology in Mexico in many ways, and an interest in the deeper Aztec past really developed out of this in the time of the Enlightenment in the early 19th century. Of course, Mexican independence came shortly after this. And this is how it became such an important icon. It became a political symbol of Mexico, displayed, of course, in the museum that was right there in the centro of Mexico. Here is Porfirio Diaz standing in this formal portrait in front of the stone, gives you a sense of its scale as well. And you see many of these kind of political portraits in Mexico. It was displayed also before this time on the outer wall of the Cathedral of Mexico, visible for all to see, which also contributed to its prominence as a icon of the ancient Mexican past. The fine spot of the Piedra del Sol was right about here in this aerial photo of the historic center of Mexico City on the eastern, kind of southeastern side of the Zócalo. And this is important. It was found here accidentally during some rebuilding of the plaza. The importance of this location, I think, has to do with the Palacio Nacional here, which is the location in the pre-Columbian past of the actual palace of Moctezuma, right? So the Palacio Nacional is occupying a space that has pre-Columbian resonance, much like the Zócalo itself. The Zócalo is not purely a European plaza. It actually was built where there was a very large plaza, or tianquistli, in the urban landscape of ancient Tenochtitlan. The Templo Mayor is, of course, right up here, right? So a little bit to the north of that. Now, there's some, let's see if I may, no, okay. There's some interesting references to stones that may be the calendar stone. In the writing of the famous early historian and chronicler, Fray Diego Duran, he describes in the Plaza Mayor, a number of sculptures. And it says here in writing in 1576, on one was painted the image of the sun, and on others the count of the years, months, and days. This sounds a lot like the Piedra del Sol, one of those at least. One of the stones which I've mentioned stood where sacrifices were begun, and the other where the sacrifice ended. And this next part is quite interesting. Many of us today have some knowledge regarding them. And one of the stones was in the main square of the city for a long time. It stood next to the canal where today an open-air market is held in front of the royal mansion. This is precisely what I was just describing in front of the Palacio Nacional. The so-called royal mansion is the palace. The canal was there on the southern side of the Zócalo until quite recently, in fact, and that was the canal used to bring goods into the market that occupied that area. This second paragraph here is quite interesting too. The mention here of slaves, of African slaves in Mexico, essentially gathering near this stone. Perhaps it is the calendar stone, perhaps not. It's really fascinating to me. This is another topic for someone maybe to study in more depth. But the reference here to the burial, the intentional burial of the stone, really makes one think that this is, in fact, the calendar stone itself that he's talking about. The Archbishop of Mexico, Montúfar, who is referenced here, he didn't really start, I think, until 1553 in his role. And this really gives us an interesting time frame, right? There were actual Aztec monuments lying about for decades, even after the conquest, despite the Templo Mayor being razed, despite the destruction. here's a direct reference to a major Aztec sculpture being out in the open in the Zócalo, what is now the Zócalo. Here's an image of that same space in the late 1600s. The find spot was, again, right about here. A century later, here's the canal and the market that Duran is describing, that essentially was the space also for a pre-Columbian market as well. This is a reconstruction image, a very enticing one, I think. It's a really realistic looking painting of what Moctezuma's palace may have looked like. And here, in fact, is the same space of the Zócalo, right? So this is where the Palacio Nacional is. The cathedral right now is over here, and the Templo Mayor and the Sacred Precinct are to the north. So I'm going to talk about this space here. This is where the Piedra del Sol was found. I should also mention it weighs over 20 tons. I don't necessarily think it moved around a whole lot. It's very hard to drag something like that around. So again, for what it's worth, that might be a point in favor of thinking it was around this place. In terms of interpretations of the calendar stone, it's very often described as a quauxicalli. This is a Nahuatl term for that literally means an eagle vessel. It's a receptacle for sacrificial blood, for hearts. This term could also be extended to these disc-shaped altars. Here are two that are from Tenochtitlan. The large one is the Stone of Tizoc, a monument of registering the conquests of the Mexica under a previous ruler. And you can see the similarity, right? You see the solar design on the upper surfaces facing towards the sky. This is a much smaller altar that's now in the Princeton Art Museum that also can be called a quauxicalli. So this is a term that's been applied to the calendar stone, a place of sacrifice, a place of offerings. I think that's certainly true. But I think there are also some other functions we can bring into the mix here. One of these functions is another kind of altar, and these aren't exclusive categories. I think there's a lot of overlap between them. This is that term I mentioned before, momostli, right? Literally a daily place. It comes from the word mostla in Nahuatl, which means tomorrow or the next day. And the idea here is that these are altars that are out in the open, that are often in plazas or at crossroads. And they're places for folks who walk around and travel to make offerings. I think they're rather similar to some of the cross shrines one sees in rural Mexico or Guatemala today. These, I think, are the descendants of this idea of a momostli. Duran, again, describes them, right? And he talks about them being along the roads and in the market, right? On those in the market, according to Duran, there were fastened carved stones as big as a shield, and on them sculpted a round figure like the face of the sun, with some paintings like flowers, and around it with circles, blah, blah, blah. So this, again, sounds very much like what we're talking about, right? And this is not a new observation. This is something that has been pointed out by others. The calendar stone and the altar that it must have been, wherever it was, does seem to sound a lot like one of these momostlis. In fact, there is a stone in the National Museum in Mexico City, and many others, in fact, that look a lot like one of these discs in a much more abstracted and simplified way. There was a very important article that inspired my thinking by Leonardo Lopez Lujan and his colleagues in 2010, which identified one of these market stones. And it was identified as such because it has emblazoned on the top of it, not just an image of the sun, but more specifically the image of a hieroglyph for the word tianquis, tianquistli, which is market. It's a three-dimensional hieroglyph that Leonardo identified as a market stone, exactly like Duran was describing. Here is an example of the hieroglyph for tianguis or tianquistli. Those of you who speak Mexican Spanish know the word tianguis very well, right? It means market. It's still used for supermarkets and all sorts of market spaces, commercial spaces, and it comes from Nahuatl. What this represents is a little difficult to say. It could be just one of these altars, in fact, but here's a representation of it from the Codex Mendoza, tianquis lugar de mercado, right? The place of the market. Again, from Duran, in one of the illustrations of his Historia, here is a large market hieroglyph, very playful. It's a market hieroglyph that frames an image of a market, right? It's a hieroglyph that is also a container for the scene. And it has, I think, the stone in the center here as well, right? So here are the various sellers and commodities for sale, including slaves. Other examples of this tianquis sign in the manuscripts you show up here with footprints often, right? And these segmented elements. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is because there is quite a bit of overlap with this idea of a sacrificial stone on a platform or an altar and the market or plaza glyph. Tianquistli as a word means not just market, but it means a plaza, right? Clearly we're having examples here. We're seeing examples of overlap between categories. You see here this warrior. He's about to be sacrificed, kind of a gladiator figure, below an image of the sun. And on the stone that he is standing upon is also an hieroglyph that looks a lot like what we'll see on the calendar stone itself, right? Here's another example of one of these sun altars. And there's another term I want to bring into the mix because it's been mentioned many times in previous interpretations. Temelacat, which is a, literally means a stone malacat. A malacat is a malacate, right? A spindle whorl, something that spins and moves around. These were stones used in gladiatorial sacrifice. And here, in fact, you see the sacrificial victim who was tied to the stone, right? This is identical to what we were just looking at here, right? So this idea of movement, of spinning is very important. These are all categories that overlap. So I would posit, and again, I'm kind of speculating here, that these categories, these words in Nahuatl, all apply in certain ways, right? Yes, it was a place of sacrifice. Yes, it was a place for gladiatorial combat, much like these other examples. But that in its design, really encoded into it more than the others is this idea of a daily place, a momostli, that probably reflects its positioning in some sort of open air location. This is a very speculative drawing sketch that I did of perhaps how the calendar stone was originally set up, really inspired mostly by this illustration from Duran. But again, this is speculative. There's no direct evidence for this, archaeologically or physically, but it had to have been horizontal wherever it was. So again, going back to Gentling's illustration, working hypothesis, it may well have been out here in front of Moctezuma's palace as part of the plaza, the Tianquistli, and the market. There are more hieroglyphs, right? In addition to the Tianquis hieroglyph, which you see reflected in these segmented elements and these little radiating lines you see all around, right? That corresponds to this. We also have the image of the sun itself, the Tonatiuh, which is the word for the sun in Nahuatl. Literally, it is a noun that means he who goes along in warmth or goes along becoming warm. That's what Tonatiuh means literally. This is its hieroglyph, we know from the Mendoza Codex and other places. And what you're really looking at here is a fusion of these two elements, and a lot more as well. But that's really what the frame of this is, right? So I think it's important to note that Tianquis or Tianquistli is encoded in the calendar stone. There are present day examples of this, and this is quite extraordinary. In Momostenango in Guatemala, there's that word Momostli, right? Momostenango is a Nahuatl place name in Guatemala. The place of altars, or the town of altars, is literally what that means. And today, there are many altars around Momostenango and in the center. And here you see the Quiche Maya there, who are venerating there almost on a daily basis. One of the altars, in fact, is in the market. This is exactly what Duran is describing. I was amazed to see this photo of a rectangular or square altar, masonry space, in the town market in the central plaza, which is used to burn trash. It's also used on ceremonial days for as one of the altars, like other ones around town. This is one of the momostlis. So it has multiple purposes, right? It is a daily place. It's a place where people daily go about their lives. And it's a place for daily kind of sacred ceremonies and other kinds of things as well. These are all over the town of Momostenango. In the last few minutes here, I just want to mention some precedents for what I'm talking about. In the Maya area, we have circular altars all over Maya sites and in other places in Mesoamerica. But I really want to focus on the Maya here for a couple of minutes. Yaxchilan, for example, has many of these circular stones that are inscribed with hieroglyphic inscriptions recording time periods. They're focused on the calendar and anniversary statements, things like that. These were interactive stones. They were probably used for the burning of incense, with incense burners atop them, ceremonial fires. We have large and small examples. One of the terms the ancient Maya used for them was sibictun, which means something like soot stone, reflecting their importance in ceremonial burning. This is a nice example from Tonina in Chiapas that shows a large date glyph of 11 Ahau in the Maya writing system. I believe that the calendar stone can be seen in this longer tradition, right, of these time stones, you might call them, right? In the Maya area, we also see captives, bound captives with rope on them, right? This is very similar to the kind of themes we're looking at in Duran's illustrations, right, of the Temelacatl, for example. We also find images of people within, in this case, a solar disk. This is a Maya sun symbol with the image of a Maya ruler inside of the sun, who is specifically named here with a hieroglyphic label, Shield Jaguar of Yaxchilan. There are many examples of these. This interplay of imagery and hieroglyphic writing also comes through in this newly discovered stone altar from the site of Cancuen. It's a hieroglyph, 3 Ahau or 3 Etznab, but inside of it is the portrait of the king. Right? He embodies time. He embodies the calendrical period and the cosmology associated with it. So in the center of the calendar stone, the hieroglyph that everyone knows and has recognized is a date, right? It is for movement or for earthquake, Nahuatl. It is the frame for the central portrait. It has the 4 dots here, and then the Olin symbol around it. Here's a more simple version of it, by the way. This is the name of the current era, of course, the name of the current sun that the Aztecs lived in, at least. Whether we do or not, I'm not sure. But this was the name of the sun in Aztec times. There were 4 previous suns. Nahuatl, or 4 movement, is the 5th. And so they are indicated, the earlier ones, in the little arms here of the Olin symbol. 4 jaguar, 4 wind, 4 rain, 4 water. These are the previous suns. Also, I'll come back to that in a second, but also we have around the central image, the 20-day signs of the Mexica calendar. This is one of the reasons why it's been called the Calendar Stone, of course. Now, one of the things that's interesting here is that these are all in a counterclockwise arrangement, if you read them in order. And I think this encoding the movement of the stone, right? This idea of spinning, this idea of solar movement and cycles. Again, also, not to maybe talk too much about it, but all of these days and elements here, again, are indicating its function as a momostli, a daily place, right? That is the visual messaging about the center of the stone that you see here, right? So there's movement throughout this that is part of the design, in a very brilliant way. It's a dynamic image, at least in temporality. And this reflects, as Richard Townsend has argued, this idea of ceremonial movement and ceremonial space in plazas, which is the counterclockwise movement of processions and dances is also encoded, the same thing that's encoded in the calendar stone. So finally, last thing, I know I'm going long. I just want to talk about who this is. There have been a lot of ideas. It's the sun god. It's the earth lord. It's the night lord, the night sun under the earth, right? These are all ideas that have been proposed over the years. And I wouldn't say that any of them are wrong. I think actually all of these proposals have a lot going for them. Clearly it is the sun, right? It's in the center of the solar disk, but there's a lot more to it as well. And one of the things that I am emphasizing in my study is that the artists labeled who it is, and that this really hasn't been noticed before. The names have been noticed before, but not its association with the image itself. There are 2 hieroglyphs above the face. One is the personal name glyph of Moctezuma II, and the second one is the calendar name 1 Flint, which is the ceremonial name for Huitzilopochtli, the Aztec patron god. Here is an example of Moctezuma himself with his name glyph, right? That is the same one we see here. Again, this has been known for a long time. Moctezuma, by the way, his name literally means he who frowns or grimaces like a lord. Wonderful name. I wonder if it has something to do, in fact, with the image here, but that's something else to talk about later. We know from other monuments of this time that Moctezuma and Huitzilopochtli were paired together, as we see here on the Teocalli Sacred War. Moctezuma was the counterpart to the Mexica patron god, right? As the Mexica ruler, he was a representative of Huitzilopochtli. We see fused portraits of Mexica rulers in other locations. In the Codex Xolotl on the Stone of Tizoc here, portraits of historical individuals dressed as Huitzilopochtli, right? This is part of the standard presentation of a Mesoamerican ruler, right? Is to have these supernatural or religious identities fused with their own. The Maya do this all the time, and so do the Mexica. So my larger point here is that these hieroglyphs above the face specifically label this as a portrait of Motioxoma. I think that is the overarching message of the monument, that it is the ruler, the historical ruler, shown with his crown, looking at the cosmos, looking from the earth above, as an embodiment of time, as an embodiment of the sun, as an embodiment of the everyday course of the sun as well, the momostli, right? And its association with the palace, I think, is direct. If it was placed in front of the palace of Motioxoma, it's there to, in a sense, label that space as his own. So these are the three kind of main interpretive points I wanted to make, right? It's a political monument. This is a new dimension, I think, that hasn't really been appreciated before as a portrait of a deified ruler. It bridges these concepts of royal space in the royal court with public space and kind of public engagement as a momostli, right? So these are the main points. That's it. I've gone a long time. I apologize if I've gone too long. I will stop sharing there. There's a lot more I didn't talk about. Anyway, I hope that was coherent and interesting to you all.
Thank you so much, David. It was fascinating. I mean, I don't have a clue about any of these. So for me, it was like revealing and enlightening. So I would like, before going to questions, to have David comment on the book and the presentation, and then we will have minutes to address all the many questions that are coming in the chat from our viewers through the live streaming in Facebook.
Well, thank you, Adela, and thank you to my tocayo, David, for writing such a nuanced book about this monument that adds so many layers of meaning to its symbolism and meaning and its potential uses. I'm compelled by many parts of it, and I will also ask questions relating to ones that I think probably are the ones that are more controversial, like the identification. So, you know, where I come at this from a background with having former mentors of mine. So, for instance, Tony Avini, the cultural astronomer, probably first introduced me to this monument. And as you note, there's a lot of sky imagery here. He talked about the pecked images on the side, which came through in your cover image, or the first image of the presentation. And of course, you talk about Bayer had talked about this way back almost 100 years ago, or over 100 years ago, right. Of sort of the sky imagery of the Ilhuacat, or the sky band motif that you can see on the circumference of the ring. But there are also these pecked images that might link to some sort of constellations or other astral imagery. Now, if it was a momostli in a platform like that, those wouldn't have been visible. Nevertheless, they would have been meaningful. And I love the comparison to the Motmot marker in Copan, which is a similar shaped, it's a much smaller monument, but it also is covered with a floor. And so those the tenons, or whatever you would call the extra part that wasn't sculpted, would stick under the floor. So an observer wouldn't view that, but the sculptor would know the significance and that it's framed in the sky. Then as a graduate student, I took Aztec art with Cecilia Klein. And so we, of course, had a whole week on the sunstone and many of these readings, and different interpretations on the central figure and whether this is Tonatiuh, or of course she favored something like the Lord of the Night, Yoatacutli, that's tied to the earth, and then there's an earth sky imagery, which I think you weave together very nicely and allow for many possibilities. Susan Milbrath more recently proposed an eclipse, or that this is the sun connected with the earth in some sort of eclipse fashion. So, one way of framing the monument then is that it's polyvalent, and then in some level, to someone who is trying to understand the interpretation of this, that might seem unsatisfactory. Like polyvalent is a cop-out. Like it means all interpretations are good. You can just lump them on together. But I think that you've shown that Mexica thought, Mexica philosophy, especially religious philosophy. So historians of religion talk about Aztec religion in particular, and probably Mesoamerican more broadly, as being pantheistic, not monotheistic, not polytheistic, but pantheistic, and creation is the divinity. And it was also, and still remains, monistic, that there aren't these dualisms, like Cartesian dualisms between sacred and profane, of course, that it's rather you have these essences like Teot, often glossed as a god by the Spaniards, but we know it wasn't a god. It was a sacred force, or tonal or tonali, like Tonatiuh, radiating this energy, sort of the life force that animates the universe. And creation then is the deity itself, right? There's no deity standing outside of creation. And so what is materialized by those five suns are those epochs of creation. The other thing that he mentions in the book is difracismo, which is often translated in English as metaphoric couplets, which are so rich in Nahuatl. And here, I think we're seeing difracismo in imagery with text accompanying it. And we know this. So, one famous one is Atlachinoli, burning water, these two juxtaposed opposites that are complementary with each other, then have meaning as a generative force and as a creative force, and underlie almost everything from the Templo Mayor. They're on the Teocalli of Sacred War that you showed as well, and it's such an important concept. So to be able to weave in all these symbolisms and talk about polyvalence and layers of meaning really resonates with me. So I guess I want to go to having been a political science major as an undergrad, and continuing to be interested in systems of governance in Mesoamerica. Unpacking a little bit, if this is a statement of divine kingship, that in some ways that is anomalous for central Mexico, not for the Maya region, but it's not something that we see as abundantly throughout the sequence in central Mexico, even when, in the Olmec sphere, Chalcatzingo does something different. And of course, Teotihuacan is anomalous in how it's representing power and leadership in certain ways. And I would even say within the Aztec canon, prior to Moctezuma, there are limited, of course, we saw the stone of Tizoc, but I do have a few images to accompany these points here. So just thinking about politics, how politics are framed, and also differences between political messaging and its reception. These are, I think, some that I'd have for you. So, can you see this?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry, Zoom quit message over here. This is along the lines of message, right? And so if Moctezuma is making a claim to divine kingship, what did other people think about that? Especially
You hung up for a second, David.
You freeze, David. Can you hear us? You're muted.
Yep.
David Carballo.
Sorry about that.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try to share again, but if it's giving me problems, I'll just speak through the slides. But here's a passage from Florentine Codex Book 12, which of course Sahagún compiled with scribes from Tlatelolco. These are also Mexica. They shared the same island as the Tenochca Mexica. But you can see the bias they had towards Moctezuma as a sovereign, that he was feared. When they burnt his body, it gave off a stench. And so they have this negative portrayal of Moctezuma in contrast to their own Tlatoani, Itzcoatzin, who is buried with honors, and people grieved him. So this idea, of course, that people like Matthew Restall and other authors, Lockhart before him, talk about micro-patriotism, micro-ethnicity within the Aztec world, and I think that's reflected in comments such as this. There's also, there we go. The other part of Mexico that I've worked in is Tlaxcala. And of course, Tlaxcala are the main rivals to the Tenochca Mexica, and had a very different form of political organization that's quite debated. Recently has been portrayed as a republic, but actually Cortés himself even called it a republic, a more shared rule structure. Unclear that, and I should say that a copy of this document, which is the Lienzo de Tlaxcala, there's a very important one that's in the Benson Library in UT. So this idea of more pluralistic or power sharing, and a council that held rulers in check, that operated in Tlaxcala, and even that commoners could access that system. So it's a more pluralistic type governance system. We also have Cholula, a site Adela knows well, where there's was more of a shared rule structure. So the Tlaquiache and Aquiache as the two principals, but then also a Sihuacoat type figure, like the Mexica had an internal affairs figure, the Chichimeca that you see on this image from the Historia Tolteca Chichimeca, and then also the council house below, the turquoise house that you see in the bottom of this monument. So again, a sort of more power sharing structure. Now, something that Jim Lockhart and others have proposed is that the Mexica also once had a more power sharing structure, and that they had, in fact, I mean, for the first 50 years of Tenochtitlan, it was subject to other polities like Azcapotzalco, but there was no king. So there were these 4 governors, and perhaps what became the 4 districts of Tenochtitlan had their own platoque, or they had their own sort of rulership structure that even persisted into the imperial period, where sort of urban renewal programs could be done by district rather than by this centralized ruler. Now, of course, the ruler who changed things here is this one on the left, Itzcoatl, the great empire builder, who took the throne in 1427 and had all of the previous Mexica histories or codices we can imagine burned. And so this was a rewriting of political history and a strengthening of the rulership, the Tlatoani structure, probably at an expense of whatever existed earlier as migrating Aztec groups, and even in the first few generations of Tenochtitlan's history. And so then what we're seeing with Moctezuma is the extension of this into claims for divine kingship, which I find fascinating. And I wonder, making a parallel with cases from roughly the same time in Europe, we have, Louis XIV, the so-called Sun King, from a very monarchical type system in France at the time, versus those Venetian or northern Italian oligarchic republics, which is exactly what Cortés compared Tlaxcala to. So a spectrum of political organization that existed in central Mexico. And starting with Itzcoatl, the Mexica went on to this track of increasingly concentrated power in the principal's hands, or in the ruler's hands, to the point that we get in this mature expression of imperialistic art, which the Sunstone exemplifies, this statement that reminds me of Louis XIV, or another Sun King. So to have some questions associated with this, I'm curious, what you think of in terms of precedent. Of course, there's classic Maya precedent, but then what are the other traditions within central Mexico that they might have been drawing on or might have been purposefully ignoring as they changed into this more sort of imperialistic paradigm in the early 16th century? And then also as a place that normal Tenochca or visitors to Tenochtitlan were visiting on a relatively daily basis, what do you think they thought of it? I mean, how, what do you think, how do you think this news would have been received? Was it like what the Tlatelolca thought of Moctezuma, or, it's hard to say, of course, it's hard to get in the heads of, the masses, the thousands of people who would have been in this tianguis pretty much on a daily basis. But those sort of the tension between political messaging and its reception. And then one last final point, and you didn't have time to get to this, but I really recommend people looking at the appendix to this book, which is on the legend of the suns, or the Leyenda de los Soles, and Dave's proposal that there could be some correlation, not a one-to-one year correlation, but an idea of cycles of Mesoamerican culture history, particularly Central Mexican culture history as we understand them archaeologically, and the different four suns that are referenced as acts of creation prior to the fifth sun. And so here, this is work, of course, that Leonardo Lopez Lujan and many colleagues have done around Templo Mayor, of showing how the Mexica were purposefully referencing history, different historical periods, sometimes extremely explicitly in the case of having a pseudo-Teotihuacano temple, and also the Tula-style benches of the House of the Eagles adjacent to the Great Temple. But then in other cases, an Olmec mask or multiple Olmec objects deposited within this holiest of holies. And then more recently, working with Javier Urcid, talking about writing from Xochicalco as being an inspiration for the Mexica writing system. And so if we sort of tie these to the different suns, we have that first sun of what we think of as the pre-classic or formative period, Olmec horizon. What's missing, at least on this slide, it would be that second sun. But I should say that this interval of the later formative period into the classic, it straddles some really important stuff in Central Mexican history, Cuicuilco, transitioning to Teotihuacan. Elsewhere in Mesoamerica, it's the rise of Monte Alban and El Mirador. It's sort of large-scale regional urbanism happening in that period. Then you have the early classic period and the glory of Teotihuacan, and then you have the late classic period, the apogee of the Maya, but also what we call in central Mexico the epiclassic, and these fusions. That's especially where you see these hybrid type styles of Central Mexican and Maya art come together in places like Xochicalco, which Lopez Lujan and Urcid link clearly to the writing system of the Aztecs. So I thought that was a really wonderful way of framing historical memory. It's often, unfortunately, imagined, especially in popular histories that will talk about, say, the Conquista. They talk about Spanish deep history and don't at the same time appreciate that Mesoamericans had their own historical memory, reflected on it very purposefully, worked it into their art and architecture and offerings and religious practice. So there's a few thematic questions there. There's other more technical ones, like I'm really interested in what you think of the on the Moctezuma possible name, on the turquoise diadem. There seems to be an image on the front of it, which maybe looks like the claws that you see on the hands or on the shoe coat, and also in the Tecpat image, the one Tecpat that could be Huitzilopochtli's calendar name, that image that's sticking out of it, which seems to be some sort of maybe an atlatl. I'm not exactly sure. Yeah. I wonder if that brings anything to your reading, or what you think of those. Yeah. So those are more technical questions, and the broader ones are just sort of how you see this is an expression of divine kingship that has certain precedents, but also it is unprecedented, at least in immediate Mexica history. It takes it to a whole new level, and how would have that been received by subject populations? So thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you, David. That's great. Wonderful coverage there, and really good questions. You know, when I have taught some of these newer ideas about the calendar stone, the sunstone, in my own classes, I actually use the Louis XIV Sun King analogy. And there are others as well throughout Roman art, throughout well, all over the world, these ideas of kind of solar metaphors of power and radiance and authority. The term divine kingship is one we use all the time, for good reason. It describes sort of what I'm talking about, but I also don't want to take an image such as the calendar stone and try to extrapolate something about political organization from it. I don't think that's possible. I think what we're looking at really is a fairly conservative design. It's innovative in its complexity, but I think it's essentially conservative in its thematics. And it's great that you brought up some of Leonardo's discoveries of these heirloom objects and styles and references in the Templo Mayor, right? Because what I see in the calendar stone, and I didn't really get a chance to get into it, is it's not that they're looking at altars at Yaxchilan, or as a precedent for this. They're looking at this very long-term kind of artistic trope that is filtered through centuries in Mesoamerica. We find it at Chichen Itza, we find it at Tula, just studying the images of sun discs and how you see rulers and warriors portrayed in solar frames or ancestors, right? We can look at that as an expression of divine kingship, but I think it's essentially an expression of power and of a metaphor that we find also in in descriptions of the Florentine Codex and other sources. The radiance of a king, right? The radiance of authority. We can call that divine kingship, but I think it's a more subtle idea. It goes back to even what Alfredo Lopez Austin was talking about with his important discussions of this idea of the hombre dios, right? The individual ruler who is at once a human and who at once can embody some of these important individual identities from the sacred world or from the world of mythology. This is something that I see as a constant throughout Mesoamerica, and it cuts through, I think, lots of these ideas of political structure and governance. Because of its antiquity, I think it just holds power on its own. And rulership and authority in a visual way, in terms of visual messaging, I think always from time to time would use this convention. I see it in the early post-classic. I see it certainly in Oaxaca. It's something that I think the Aztecs were well aware of. I think the artisans in particular, the Toltecat, right, the ones who were learning these conventions of representation, were tapping into these really old conventions and had really good documentation for them. They may not have seen them as going back to, Maya ideas of divine kingship. I don't think it was that direct at all, but I do think that they were aware of how old it was. So I don't know if that really answers your question. I'm really glad that you brought up these ideas of variations in structures of authority in central Mexico and throughout all of Mesoamerica. Um, what I sense from looking at the rhetoric of hieroglyphic texts or the imagery of iconography is that, again, we can't discern those kinds of things necessarily from what the rulers and the elites are presenting to us. Their messaging is about some of these transcendental states of being and that involve religious imagery. And this is kind of a universal thing, I think.
Do we want to take some questions from the audience?
I think so. We have several. I don't know if Paloma would like to be in charge for this, or
I can do that. So David, we want to thank you, both of you. We have really a really engaged audience, almost 80 people. Those are just the one that log in through Facebook. Many others were watching without logging in. Let me start with a question from our alumnus, Ron Mather. As displayed in the Anthropology Museum, the stone is an eye-catching monument. Would be there any benefits on displaying this in an horizontal rather than a vertical fashion?
That's a great question. Whenever I'm in the National Museum and I see it, of course, it's striking the way it's presented. And it's obvious why it's presented that way. But I have wondered if, in the space of the museum, it might be possible to use a replica of a cast or a one-to-one scale replica of the monument and maybe show it in a way that it was originally meant to be seen, right? So that as you approach it, you don't necessarily see the face looking straight at you, right? You're seeing it at this very acute angle. And there's carving on the side, as David was talking about, and as I mentioned in the book and others have talked about, that I didn't even get to show you, that's again part of the messaging. So I don't think the curators of the National Museum in Mexico are ever going to change how it's displayed, but I do think it would be wonderful to have maybe some sort of interactive replica. I've even wondered if we could do this at UT, Adela, if we could get a copy of it and put it somewhere, in around campus, at least a temporary kind of display of it, or somewhere around Austin. That would be
we can do it like next to the tower,
There you go.
If I could just add something to that, I'm compelled by the sky-earth dualism.
Yeah,
imagery could be there. I mean, whether or not it's, and again, this gets to the the sort of monistic and pantheistic religion where things fuse into each other and they're messy, and that it causes problems. It makes it difficult to teach because students want to know, well, what God is this? Like a specific,
exactly.
Cleanly defined God. But if it can be this sort of dualisms, complementary dualisms, it makes sense to have it on a horizontal plane, especially with these ideas of sun at zenith and nadir or anti-zenith, which are so important for Mesoamerican peoples. Most peoples who live in the tropics, the zenith, when the sun is directly overhead, and we have this throughout Mesoamerica, we have these zenith passage tubes and stela that are charting that, and we know that it was critically important. So to be in that axis of what we think of as up-down, but is sort of the sun at its apogee and at its nadir, makes sense to me, like in terms of placement, even though the visual impact would be different than having it vertically.
Yeah, I mean, many of us know from experience, being in a big open plaza in Mexico, with a blazing sun, it can be a blinding experience, right? And I've often wondered if maybe some of these metaphors about markets and plazas it's almost like it's a mirror of the sun, right? That's kind of reflecting off, as in that Duran illustration, it shows the sun above and the sun that he's standing on. That idea of zenith and nadir, I didn't even get to talk about that, but you know, the word Tianquistli is also the word for the Pleiades to get to astronomy, David, right? So, you know, this brings up a whole other possibility of kind of a dualism between two really key celestial objects or celestial spaces, right? Which is the sun and the Pleiades, one diurnal, one nocturnal. And you know, hard to prove these things, but I do think that's part of this, right? It's about centrality and in the cosmic axis.
Mhm.
Okay, so the next question is from Armando Quintanilla. How many Aztec codex survived genocide? I know there was only 4 Maya codex that survived.
Oh, the number. Well, David can help me out on this. There were some important pictorial documents. Many of the pictorial documents that we have from central Mexico were actually produced after 1520 in Tenochtitlan or in other communities. In fact, throughout the 16th century, there were pictorial documents being made in kind of a pre-Columbian style that we may sometimes call a codex. It's hard to date some of these manuscripts. I'm thinking of the members of the Borgia group, probably pre-Columbian, but you know, it's hard to say. This was a time of, in the early colonial period when there were lots of possibilities. And so it's hard to say how many are pre-Columbian and how many aren't. Even on indigenous materials, they could be made in the 1520s or 1530s. So in terms of numbers, we have many more pictorial documents from central Mexico than we do from the Maya area. Specific numbers is hard to say. David, maybe you could help me out.
So if we're considering highlands, so mixing Aztec and Mixtec,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe something like people will talk about 5 to 6. The Fejivire Maya or the Codex Tezcatlipoca, it's recently been renamed, would definitely be one. The Borgia and others in that group, not all, but these are then Mixtec. There's debate about where the first two come from. Something like the Mendoza or Matricula de Tributos, some have commented maybe it was immediately pre-conquest and then those glosses came in the decade afterwards. But yeah, it's under 10, I would say. Safely. Yeah.
From Emiliano Ricardo Melgar, congratulations, David. Interesting interpretation. What do you think about the unfinished broken part of the sunstone with the dotted surface?
Well, this is what David was mentioning. There are, to the side of the disc of the design in the stone, these drilled or pecked holes that are in lines or in certain arrangements. Now, whether it's an unfinished monument is a question that's come up. I know that I think it was Hermann Bayer who first proposed that it was a unfinished sculpture that was going to be carved down into a full disc, like a Quauxicali that I showed. I'm skeptical of that. I think what we're seeing is more or less the complete monument. The pecked or drilled holes may well have astronomical significance, as has been talked about by Tony Avini and others. I'm kind of neutral on that. I just don't know. It's hard to make an interpretation of them as specific astronomical bodies, you know, of constellations or whatever. But it wouldn't surprise me if there's something there either about the night sky or, you know, that resonates with these other ideas of kind of nocturnal diurnal oppositions like we were talking about. That's tough. It's a very tough thing to answer, but I would say in answer to the question, I don't think it's an unfinished monument. I think it's what we have is what the artist conceived.
Sky Rodriguez says, this is so interesting. Are there any books you recommend for studying on your own?
Oh, well, there's some excellent books on Aztec art and iconography. There is a fairly recent kind of compendium of sources on the calendar stone itself that was published in 2005, I believe. That was edited by Mary Miller and Matthew Robb. The title escapes me. I think it's just called the Calendar Stone. There are basic books on Aztec art. One of the ones I use in my teaching is been around for a long time, by Esther Pastori, just called Aztec Art, and it's a fabulous source. There's some great scholars out there. Cecilia Klein, Emily Umberger. There are anything really written by Leonardo Lopez Lujan, Eduardo Matos, the noted archaeologist who's been working in the Templo Mayor, both of them for years. There's so much literature out there about this material. It's impossible to keep track of.
And there's a question from Soren Pedersen. He would like to know if there's other examples of other Tlatoani being deified in the same way.
I believe so, yes. There are multiple images. Well, let me preface this. Portraits of Tlatoani, or the rulers of Tenochtitlan, are not common in sculpture. We have many images of them from pictorial documents from the colonial period, but actual sculpted representations of rulers are surprisingly uncommon. They're really just a handful. And many of these, I would say most of them, involve a deified portrait. So for example, there is a portrait, another portrait of Moctezuma is on the cliffside or the rock exposed at Chapultepec, right in the park, right below the castle. You can walk almost right up to it today. It's been largely destroyed, but originally it was a standing portrait of Moctezuma. And it's clear from what's left of it that he was shown not just simply as a king in a simple portrait, but probably in the guise of of Xipe Totec or of some other deity. We have images of Ahuitzot on the aqueduct stone, where his image is fused with Quetzalcoatl. Right, there's so many of these. This is kind of what I was getting at before. It's the norm to see a formal portrait of a Mesoamerican ruler as a deified person. That is the norm. That's the de facto kind of tradition. And that's why I think the calendar stone actually makes sense. Rather than being an anomaly, I see it as something that's just an ambitious and a particularly kind of elegant presentation of it in an abstracted way.
We have many notes of congratulations. We won't be able to read all of them, but I'm going to pass the word now to our director.
Well, yes, we joined those congratulating messages. Both David Stuart and David Carballo, you have many fans, and so we should invite you more often here at the virtual site of Lilas Benson. Thank you so much to Paloma too for organizing, and we will keep the conversation, of course, and hopefully in person next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adela.
Thank you.
Paloma.
Thank
you,
you.
David.